Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I have an amazing guest, and we are going to talk about some pretty interesting things. First, let me just say a couple of things about Elayna Fernandez. She is a storyteller, a story strategist, and a student of pain. We'll talk about that in a moment. She is named one of the 125 top leaders to know in 2022 by Success Magazine. She is named one of the 100 top influencers in the USA 2 years in a row, and she's named one of the top parenting blogs worldwide. That is just a few things. So, Elayna, you know what you're talking about. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today on the topics that we're going to cover.
Oh, thank you so much, Emmy. I'm so happy to be here with you and thrilled. I mean, I love you so much, and you're such an inspiring leader in this world. So being with you is an honor right now.
Well, thank you. I feel the same about you. And I want to start by your interesting titles that you give yourself. So you call yourself a storyteller, and you are, as I've heard some of your stories. For anybody that doesn't know Elayna, she has just given two TED Talks, is it? TEDx Talks. But you have a powerful, powerful story. I mean, I know I have been moved to tears hearing you talk about it. I know others, I'm sure, are. So I would love for you to tell us, what do you think is the power in storytelling? How can that help us heal throughout our own pain and journeys?
Oh my gosh, do you have like 48 hours so we could stay? Thank you for asking that because um, I consider myself a storyteller first and foremost. That's the number one love of my life. I will tell you that I fell in love with storytelling when I was a tiny little girl. And I remember, coming to school. I went to school when I was 2 years old. So I actually graduated high school when I was 15. And I was already having suicidal thoughts at age 5. And I was, I think, on the second or third grade. And I was 5 years old, and I went to my teacher and I wrote a story. And I would write the story of what was going on in my home, which was horrific. And I would write it in the third person, and I would tell this story for my teacher. And I would write it where she would correct my homework. So the way it worked, I don't know, it was a different country and different times. So the way it worked is that you took your homework to your teacher, and she would, look at your notebook, and she would give you a grade. But I also wrote that little story there. And I remember it was the only place, and I want to cry right now. It was the only place where I felt actually seen. And she would look at me, she would get down to, I've always been the shortest one, even at that age. And she would get down and she would look at me and she would give me this big hug. And I didn't experience that often where I was really truly seen. And so I learned that by writing about what was going on, not only did I feel seen by others, but also I was able to get it out of me. And so ever since I was really tiny, I would write just to process my feelings, and I would write it in the way of story. When I was 7, then my brother and I went to, we used to go to the landfill right behind the little shack where we lived in the slum. And I found a magazine. And even though it looked like a story magazine, that we called Eclipse at that time because we didn't know English, and it was highlights. And we saw that there were so many stories about these kids who had everything that we wanted to have, like wearing jeans and reading books and just all of these things that that you feel as a child that you needed to have a lovely childhood, and especially the happy faces and the joyful environment that they were able to achieve. And so, or to experience. And so at that moment, I decided that I needed to learn English so that I could have the eclipse life. And that's when I actually became a storyteller for business. The
Mm.
first time I was 7 years old, and I created my first business, which was a cardboard puppet theater. And I would tell stories. We didn't have electricity, so all the kids would give me all their coins that they had, and they would sit around this puppet theater, and I would tell them made up stories, or things that were based on stories that I've heard or that I knew or that I experienced. And they fueled me, gave me a lot of imagination. I would say visualization, because I would talk about this beautiful life that I wanted to have. And they also gained hope. And I would just glean from that energy. And so that was one thing. But then I started, writing so much for pay in my school. Like I would write breakup letters, let's be friends letters, I like you letters. It was just all kinds of poetry and letters. And that's when I discovered also poetry as a way to write about what I was feeling. So telling stories has been the thing that I have used to process my emotions ever since I was 5, and probably before that. But I remember being 5 years old and really wanting to die and processing that through my my writing. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite things to write was the story of my eulogy. And I would write that I died, and like all of these beautiful things that I was able to achieve, and how wonderful I was, and tell this story that was actually crazy because that was not my reality at all. And I was never told any of these things, on a regular basis. So I know that these stories are probably not something that you as a listener and viewer experience, but we all experience some kind of pain, and we all experience the I would say the feeling of being alone. And so through the power of storytelling, we are able to tap into our innermost desires, our innermost fears, and those things that don't make sense start to make sense through the power of storytelling. And one of the things that I always like is to use fiction as a healing tool, because when you are able to tap into, I would say, a third party as a narrator of your life, you actually gain what psychologists call emotional and psychological distance. And you're able to actually see beyond what you are feeling, because you're now in the moment as an observer or witness self. And that's something that I teach, through my techniques that I teach my moms. They're mine. I'm so sorry. But the moms in my community, um, because when we use journaling, for example, or writing the story of our lives, it can be very beneficial. But when we write it in the second or third person, we gain that wisdom and that perspective, and that it's an added layer of understanding that helps us process and move through that pain so much quicker. But again, I'm going to stop here because I could talk about this for hours and hours and like bore you forever.
No, I'm so enthralled by by what you're saying, because there were a few really powerful things that I want to highlight, so people make sure they pick up on the importance. Is the first thing that you mentioned was feeling seen. Um, this is also a strategy that people can use in their relationships. And it's one thing that I work with my clients on. And I don't even mean just with your romantic partner, but I'm sure that you kind of naturally incorporate this into your life when you're working, when you're talking with others. People are going to be so much more receptive to what you have to say if they first feel understood, seen, and heard. Because that's all any of us really want. We want to be seen and heard. And for you to say at such a young age that you weren't able to feel that at home, that writing the story and having someone acknowledge that story, right? Your teacher, that was probably one of the most important healing elements for you because have you ever, I'm sure people have, left a conversation thinking, okay, well, that person was nice or, that was cool, but not feeling truly connected or not truly feeling like they would want to have that interaction again necessarily.
Yeah.
It's because of that feeling that you described. Hopefully, if you can create an environment where both people can feel like space is being held for them, that kind of healing, that kind of connection that can happen after that point is just phenomenally higher than, if you're not being acknowledged, if your feelings aren't being validated. So I love that storytelling, story writing can kind of enable that process. And then the added layer of stepping back in the third person, that's something that I experienced as well, unknowingly. You probably started writing when you were 5 unknowingly. It's just something you naturally did, right? But when I wrote my memoir, boy, was I able to process things in a completely different way from just talking about it with a friend. And I think there's a lot of value in that third person perspective, like you're saying. And the last cool thing that I want to highlight too was you were using your imagination as a child with those puppet boxes. And, kids have this ability to just like go off on all these, tangents that don't have to make sense. But that's also the basis of like our current terminology of manifesting, right? It's like creating a vision of what could potentially be, because if you haven't imagined it, if you can't see it, then you're probably not going to get there. So all these things that you were sprinkling in of like, I used to, envision this and visualize this, and with your magazine stories, that's like giving you something to create stairs towards. And that's what I do with my clients too, is like, you have to have a clear vision of what you want your relationship to look and feel like to be able to make the choices that get you there.
Yeah.
So
And
all these valuable tools, all in storytelling and story writing. Who
yeah, and
knew?
what's really wonderful is that the visual story that they were able to tell in that magazine became my vision. And one thing that I want to highlight is that I never really truly had that childhood, but I was able to, because that led me to learn English and to change my life. I was able to get out of the slum and get opportunities that as a bilingual girl now, I was able to tap into those opportunities, and then my daughters would then have that life. So it was actually a vision that came true. It didn't come true in the way that my 7-year-old self, made it up. And so there are two things about that I wanted to speak to, and it's that learning a different language for me was unreasonable in that moment. Like, I barely knew how to speak Spanish because I was, 7 years old. I was still learning. um, but I lived in a slum where nobody spoke another language. And so that was very unreasonable. Also, it's not something that I could go to school and learn unless I paid a lot of money, what seemed like a lot of money for me. But also be open to how your vision is going to manifest. So be open about that vision being unreasonable and for you to have no idea how that's going to be created. And also be open that it may not really look like what you think will look like, but it will look like something better. Because if you would have asked me, do you want to live this life or do you want your children to have it? It's like even better, right? I have been able to tap into that vision and to see, what a joy for me to have 4 daughters and be a single mom and be able to give them everything that they need, not only the most basic things that I didn't have, but also the most beautiful things that I can tap into.
Yeah, and you have given them and are still giving them the skills to do anything they want in their life. And I know that your daughters are already published authors.
Yeah.
They're already learning about, entrepreneurship and, just basic principles that are going to serve them so much throughout their life. Um, and I'm super fascinated about your, we know that you are a great storyteller. I know you help women particularly craft stories that help them through whatever they're struggling with, or even just telling their story in general. So I've heard this a lot, and I'm sure a lot of people have this mindset is, well, I'm not a good writer, or I can't tell stories. I'm not interesting. Or, oh, I'm not funny. I can't write, tell a story. Like, what do you say to people when they come to you with this idea that they're not a good storyteller?
I love that you asked that because the thing is that, especially because I work with moms, but as women and as moms, we are the best storytellers in the planet because we're always telling stories. And if you want to see the power of storytelling, go to a, nail salon or a beauty salon, and people are telling stories. And in Spanish, we say chismosas, like we're telling everything that happened. And that's what a story is. The definition of a story is something that happened. If you can tell someone something that happened, then you can tell a story. And we're telling stories all the time. So if you, instead of like sitting in a blank, like in front of a blank page, or it could be the processor page, or in front of a paper page, and be like, oh, I need to come up with a story. It's more like pretend. And again, pretending is a great game. Using your imagination. Pretend that you're on the phone with someone, or get on the phone with someone and tell them what happened. And so it's not going to look like, I would say, Nicholas Sparks wrote it, because a written story and a told story have different textures, and it's okay. But the reason why we tell stories is different when we write and when we speak. And so start with speaking it. It's easy, it's conversational, it's going to come natural for you. And then you can embellish if you want, and you can use, the flowery terms if you want to have it written. But it really resonates more emotionally with people when it's in basic words. Actually, when we use basic, short, simple words, the places of the brain that light up are the emotional places in our brain. So we're able to connect more with people. So instead of saying, the way you communicate the narrative will impact successfully your audience. It's like, okay, thank you, representative, versus, the way you tell your story is going to connect with the people that you want to serve. It really touches on a different hemisphere of your brain. And so as you tell the story authentically, just how it comes out, you are a more impactful storyteller. And think of your, you know, elders, grandparents, your aunt or someone older than you that used to tell stories or read the Dr. Seuss books or whatever that was for you. My grandpa used to, sit me on his lap and tell me the stories of his family, or how it was back in the day. And those were the stories that have stayed with me and impacted me the most in my life. My dad used to, tell me the stories of his childhood and all the struggles that he went through. And those have really motivated me, still keep me through hard times. My dad is like my favorite person in the world. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us have that experience is, and even if you were to watch any movie, any like, especially children's movies, like there's always like, an elder telling a story or someone's telling a story and everyone is gathering to listen. And I thought it was funny when you use the, go to a nail salon, or it's like, what are you doing if you're not telling the story? You're eavesdropping on the
Yeah.
people next door, listening to their story, right? You're like, oh my gosh, I wonder what's going to happen. So
Yeah.
I love that you're kind of giving this attainable um, way of going about telling a story. Is you don't have to put the pressure on yourself to sound a certain way. Just tell it like you would to a friend.
Yeah.
That's
I,
kind of, yeah,
I,
it's kind of the
I,
mindset that I had too. Like when I was writing, my book sounds very conversational. It sounds very, it's not like fancy.
yeah.
And and I was writing it as if I was telling the story to a friend, like I was just stream of consciousness, like, making jokes here and there. And the other thing about it is that I'm sure you incorporate into yours, or that you've noticed happens, is that you you can also just allow yourself to freely express. Like sometimes if you're talking to someone, you might be like, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that to them, but I'll tell them this part of the story, right? But if you're writing it, you are free to just let it all out. And then later you can decide if you want to share it with anybody,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I was gonna, say is I tell people when I speak and I teach workshops and things like that to tell the story of their first kiss, because everybody, most everybody in the room has had a first kiss, and it's just a simple thing that everybody has experienced. And it's such a beautiful thing to see how everyone has a different experience. Some people are like grossed out, some people are cringing, some people are just so enchanted by the experience. And that's what a story does when told authentically and from the heart and without embellishment, is that it creates a deeper emotional connection. Or when you tell a child the story of their birth. So those, that's where you can get started, like write about those things. And yes, like you said, and that's something that I wanted to highlight when I talked about my teacher earlier, that there are safe people with which, with these people you can open up and share everything. And people that are not safe, that that you gotta be guarded around them, and that maybe when you express your emotions, you're going to be judged or feel shame. We've all experienced that too. So yeah, I would like to delve into that. But when you are writing, I love what you said, without editing. It's because I want people to know you're the safest person you'll ever meet. And isn't that a great concept? Like being a safe space for yourself to land. Stopping the judgment, and writing can be a tool for you to do that, for you to practice not editing yourself. So it actually helps you be a more authentic person, because you know what? Like the page, or the whatever page, right? Is It's you. It's a reflection of you. It's not a reflection or a representation of anybody else. And so if you can be honest with the page, then that's a clue for you that it's time to get honest with yourself.
Ooh, oh my gosh, I just got goosebumps when what you just said there, because I think that that is one of the major gifts of storytelling, and especially if you're doing it in writing, where you don't have to share it with anybody else if you don't want to. But that is a gift, to be able to write honestly and tell honestly. Um, because I experienced that as well. As you always have your narrative that you say to others, right? Like what's appropriate, how much you want them to know or not know. But then being able to write it actually informs you about
Yeah.
yourself, which you might have like areas that you're blocking out, or that you don't really want to be aware of, or maybe you're just not aware, right?
Yeah.
Like one thing that I became aware of that I didn't know before I wrote the book was like I had a lot of like behaviors that of codependency in relationships. And I know that you have experience with codependency as well, and as do a lot of people. Um, you know, I have a breakup support group and there's almost 1,000 members now. And every week, we have a topic and codependency comes up all the time,
Mhm.
right? And so one thing I want, and I think you had something else you wanted to say, which I'll totally open up for you to say that. But I have my next question that I would love to ask you about is how codependency or even other kind of behaviors, they show up in more than just your romantic relationship. They can show up in how you parent. They can show up in your friendships, your family relationships, and you might not even be aware of it. And so I would love for you to speak a little bit to that as well.
Oh, absolutely. I'll jump right there. I speak to parents, and this is something that we talk about in my community all the time about being a codependent mom. Of course, there are all kinds of codependent parents, but this is not based on gender or anything like that. This is based on the ability of having healed patterns that you learned in childhood to survive. And so one of the things that we always cover is how the child or childhood experience, especially in adolescence, will create an independent child. So that's autonomy, right? And a child who knows their identity. So when we talk about identity and independence, those are the two gifts of developmental, you know, milestones that we go through childhood. So with that being said, many of us didn't get that. Our growth was stunted because we went through a lot of trauma and we were raised in, very codependent ways. And I'll explain that in a second, in which we were told to not speak because children are not heard, they're just seen. Or we were told to just believe our parent because what they say is because they said so, and they're adults, and adults know better. We were also, many people still practice this, put them in timeout. So they were alone. And, have you seen that movie, Mean Girls?
Hmm.
And the musical? And it's like, the girl comes in the tray, and if you've seen it, Regina George.
Yes.
I'm very familiar.
I think it's a like an American fan favorite movie.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you can't sit with us, right? Can't sit with us. Well, how many, had a parent that told them you can't sit with us? You can't be with us because you're too loud, or because you got angry, or because, whatever emotion that you displayed. And you are only to sit with us or to be with us. You're only worthy when you're nice and when you do as you're told. That is the definition of neglect. So whether you went through abuse, you went through the neglect, it's what happened, but also what didn't happen that was supposed to happen, then you have created this story about yourself that allows you or leads you into recreating those patterns in your relationship. And it's what we call repetition compulsion. So you find the people in your life that you're going to fix. Uh,
Mm.
so if you, were put on timeout a lot, or maybe told, many horrible things about who you are, you're going to find someone who's not emotionally available because your parents weren't, so that you can then fix this problem that was created in childhood, and finally you repeat it and you fix it. So we're all about fixing it, because the two biggest lies that we tell ourselves as children, it's my fault,
Mm.
and I can fix it. And so we go through life thinking that everything is our fault. And that's why we allow behaviors and we own behaviors that are definitely not our fault. And then we go through life trying to fix them because we believe these two lies and we are operating on those two lies. And that's why we have the shame and that we have the just it's the toxic feeling that we are not worthy and that we are not valuable and that we don't deserve whatever, happiness or whatever we desire. We don't deserve it. We have to prove, we have to earn, we have to work hard to do it because we just don't deserve it by default. And those are the lies that really cause the codependency, and they come from those messages that we got as children. And so I obviously didn't know this. uh, and glad I found out, and many of my family members would say, well, a little too late, two divorces too late, right? But actually, I'm grateful that I experienced those things to be able to heal and to have that awareness, so that my children and the people that I am called to serve can learn from me. I always say you learn from three different ways: mentors, which is why I'm in the business that I'm in, mistakes, which is why we're talking about this, and then misery, because we've all been there, right? So misery is definitely a teacher. And so through my mentorship, I try to, help people not go through so much misery and not make so many costly mistakes. So you can learn from someone else that went through that. But the thing about this is that we become codependent with our spouse. And then as moms, we become codependent with our children. All of a sudden, and that happened to me, your world is all about your child. It's like
Mm.
it's like you have no identity or independence because everything about you that you perceive as good is now tied into motherhood.
Mhm.
And anything that, your independence, any decision you make, everything that happens around your life is around this child's schedule. Some of that is healthy, and it's definitely healthy when they are, this helpless baby, because they depend on you, and that dependency is healthy. But as the child grows up, they're supposed to gain their own independence and identity and break out from you. And that's where, parents have an issue
Mm.
because now you're having withdrawals.
Yeah.
That crazy? But now, your child wants to be themselves. They want to dress the way they want. They want to, call themselves a different nickname. They have a different profession planned out than you thought and mapped out. They want to go to that school. They want to date that girl. I don't know what it is, but they're making decisions that are developmentally safe and healthy. And our inner child and inner adolescence is like, you're not supposed to be that. You're not supposed to do that. You're mine. You're my child. Kind of like, my toy,
Right.
my this. And so that's one thing we don't want to break away because that's our identity. But the second thing is we start basing our own worth on what this child does.
Mm.
So if our circle perceives that, being a doctor is what's good, right? Then we want that child to be a doctor. And if they're not a doctor, we failed as parents.
Mhm.
That's the cycle. Versus saying, you know what, they're their own person, their decisions are not a reflection of who I am. It's so liberating, but yet very rare. It's like whether you do well or don't do well, according to my standards, has nothing to do with me. What has everything to do with me is, do I love you? Do I love you unconditionally? Do I show you support? Or what I call in my, emotional wholeness framework is do I feel safe, seen, and supported?
Hmm.
If your child feels safe, seen, and supported, then you're a great parent. And of course, they're not going to feel like that 100% of the time.
And
But
that
they,
that triangle is something you can use in your romantic relationship too, because those, I mean, those three words are like I would say the foundation words for a healthy romantic relationship as
yeah,
well.
absolutely. This is universal.
Mhm.
This I use this for everything in my teachings. Is, the triangle that we least talk about. I actually teach it to corporations for leadership, because if people at work don't feel seen, safe, and supported,
Mhm.
even your highest performance is gonna go down.
Yeah.
And that's not only in the painful, but also in the happy. So for example, your child feels that this drawing was fantastic, and kind of dismisses, like, oh, really, truly, that's a giraffe, okay. And you didn't say, it's a giraffe. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Like, if you didn't celebrate the good with them, and you didn't really mourn the bad with them, then they didn't feel seen, safe, and supported. And that's the same with your employee. That's the same with your spouse. I actually talk about Gottman. I'm sure you know all the work by John Gottman. He talks about bids for connection. And
Mm.
I use that in my parenting. It's like your child's going to have a bid for connection, and you're going to, respond to that. But also, this happens in the workplace, and it's universal.
Mhm.
This need to be seen, safe, and supported is an universal need that we all have, and very few times we talk about it. And I'll tell you why, Emmy. Because it's taboo to want to need validation from other people. Like,
Mhm.
I'm supposed to be a strong person, and so me needing validation from you somehow makes me less than. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. We need to validate one another. You're a very validating person, and I, have enjoyed that. And I hope that I validated you. And it's so beautiful when we can validate each other just because we want to, and not because we need it. And so as a parent, that's that's our job, is to see our kids, to provide a safe, not only psychologically and physically, but just safe environment for them, and to support them in the path that they choose. Not to tell them who they are, not to tell them what they're supposed to do or who they're supposed to be, but to just be there in that experience. And does that mean that I don't, try to guide or steer my kids? Yes, but from a place of seeing first who they are. And
Mhm.
that's the only way that it's worked. When I've tried the other way, it has never worked. And it has led me to be what I like to call a monster. Like, when that, you know, yelly monster comes out, it's because I'm not focusing on them. I'm focusing on my triggers. There's nothing that will trigger you more than motherhood.
I bet. I'm not a mother myself, but I can only imagine. Um, but it's funny that you brought up the bids, because I just finished reading an article just last week about bids and relationships, and how you can't, I mean, some of the biggest relationship problems can just be solved by simply acknowledging
Yep.
partner.
Yep.
And what I wanted to also like make sure that people are clear about is validating somebody is not the same as agreeing with them, right? So it's simply acknowledging that you've heard what they said and that you understand it, but it doesn't mean you have to agree with it.
Right.
Right. And so for example, in a relationship, if somebody is doing a behavior that, that you don't like or you feel is harmful to you, um, you know, you don't, the other person might be doing it because they feel a certain way. Maybe they're frustrated, maybe they're angry, right? And they might express, you know, that to you. And you can acknowledge, like, I see that you're frustrated by XYZ. It doesn't mean that you have to like agree with the way they're behaving,
Yeah.
but you're still validating that they feel a certain way and you're acknowledging what they're saying, right?
Yeah, I go a little, and this is something that I always talk about. I go a little higher than that, and I call it the ministry of presence. And it has
Mm.
three components. It's silence, safety, and space. So a lot of the time, we're doing this validation that's kind of like shallow and kind of plastic, I would call it, because saying I see what you're doing and I see how you're feeling and I see, it it helps, and it's incomplete. So the first thing is to ask and just be present and listen and be silent. I always say, hold them and hold my tongue. So you hold that person, you hold space for that person. And then you just allow them to express anything that they're feeling. So, okay, here I am, show me everything, get it out. And no matter how much, you just pretend that you have that tape, that invisible tape, no matter how it triggers you and it hurts you sometimes, right? And it kind of pushes a button, you just stay there with that discomfort. And then you say, okay, I get it. If I believed, or what you're telling me, I would be so mad. So I get it that you're mad. And then you can, can I have can I have a moment to share how I see it? And maybe you can, and have that conversation. Because the thing is that usually it's coming from a story that doesn't, that has two sides. But when you validate someone, it's, I say two parts. One, you're providing that silence and that safety for them to express anything they're feeling. And then two, you're actually acknowledging that as valid. So it's not just I understand, but also I believe you. It's I believe you. I believe that what you're saying is valid. Now here's my perspective, and you can share it. And it doesn't have, you're absolutely right, Emmy. It doesn't have to be the same perspective. But when a person feels seen and safe, then it's easy to feel supported as well, and so it's a lot of work. It's not just words, it's actually providing that presence that goes deeper. And and it doesn't have to be that much work. It depends on the level of frustration. And sometimes a validation, like I said, is a positive one, like, wow, you must have worked really hard, and so I'm excited that you got that promotion. I can't even imagine like how it is to be a podcast interviewer, but I'm sure that it took a lot for you to be here. And so I'm so honored to be on this podcast. So just, you know, it doesn't have to be like that, but with our kids, sometimes, especially when they're teens, it takes that discomfort, because the thing about that is that most of their feelings are coming from the developmental uh stage that they're in, where the amygdala is hyperactive, which means that they are emotional all the time. And
Mhm.
so that is a good thing, and we try to stop it as parents. And it's different with your partner, or it should be different with your partner, right? Because they're an adult. However, most of the time, we're just having relationships with our inner teenagers as adults, which is what happened in my case. And when you're asking about being codependent, it's like, yeah, I wasn't an adult in my relationships. I was a lonely child looking for that validation, or I was an crazy adolescent looking for that wild ride, or whatever it is that was triggered in that moment. And so when we start processing all of those emotions, not only we're going to be better in our personal relationships, but also we're going to be better in our parenting relationships, in our friendships, at work, because we're not going to act from those triggers anymore.
Mhm. Yeah, and something that you had said earlier, and that you've mentioned, like we keep coming back to that idea of the narrative. I mean, you said that even as a child, you developed this narrative about, your worth, or, what it means to be a good child, or, whatever your narrative is. Um, and then we continue to create narratives throughout our whole entire life. And so my last question to you, because we're running out of time, is when you're encouraging people to tell and write their stories, that's a narrative, right? It's what they have in their head. And so is there a part of the process where you would ever encourage people to like create a new narrative if they're trying to achieve something else in their life or trying to go in a different direction? And what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I use several techniques for several different, I would say situations or circumstances. And yes, and yes. It's important for us to write out our vision and to write with such vivid detail that we can have a feeling tone for it. And that when we tell it, we can feel it we have muscle memory for it. And what that means is that you can see it so vividly as if it's happening right now, and you write it in the present tense as if it's happening right now. And when you do that and you write that vision, you can come from that vision and then create this, or make decisions from that person that you want to be. So that's one technique that I recommend anyone to do it, because it's not specific to whatever happened in your childhood, or to where you are in your life. It's something that can help anyone. However, for certain people, we could go into writing fiction that recreates a memory, or we could actually write fiction that fills into a memory that we've blocked. And those are things that will open up sometimes, things that are really tricky to navigate, and then we navigate from it. Another technique with story writing or storytelling is to also recreate a character, like psychodrama, and to act out parts. And because when you actually act out the other person, and or write it in the other person's perspective, you are able to actually tap into wisdom that you didn't have, and information that you didn't have. And that creates a lot of healing. So for example, something that everyone can do right now is, think about a parent that, in one moment was, you think that they were mean to you, or that they were also or neglectful to you, and write down the story according to them,
Mhm.
and see what comes up, when you actually act that out. And of course, with psychodrama, it's a little bit more intense, because you're acting the part out. And yeah, there are so many techniques that I use to rewrite the narrative, like you say. But the most important part is to start by writing what you know.
Mhm.
Start by writing that in the third person, and then, that's why I call myself a story strategist, because based on that is where I'm able to see what the next steps are to provide the most healing. And the cool part is that I also because that's a creative act. I also teach them how to monetize that, which is a
You teach
perk,
what?
how to monetize what they create.
Oh, lovely. Okay. I think
Yeah,
everyone's ears perked up on that part.
yeah, that's kind of like the cool thing that I ran into by accident when I was experiencing homelessness with my two toddlers at the time, and created my whole platform out of my healing work, my
Mhm.
own healing writing work, and I've been teaching moms how to do that for 18 years, and it's just really not only healing, breaking the cycle of trauma. I'm all about breaking cycles, but also breaking the cycle of poverty, which is usually linked to trauma, addiction, and other, attachment failure styles.
Mhm. So I would love for people to be able to find you and learn more about because you have a blog that has been very successful. And so that is at thepositivemom.com or
Yep.
dot. Okay. And is there any other place that people can look for you, or is that you have everything kind of primarily there?
Yeah, everything is on thepositivemom.com. There's a free community for moms on there that you can join by clicking a button. All you need is an email address and a name to join and to be a mom.
Okay.
uh, and yeah, I'm on all the social media platforms at the Positive Mom.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to share all of your experience and a bunch of your stories with us. I am eager for people to kind of hop on and on your blog and read more about what you do, and just to consider. I feel like it's one of my passions right now as well. With having just released "Who Is Your Red Dress," is like how powerful writing your story can actually be, not only to your healing, but for really allowing yourself to blossom and discover maybe even new paths or ways of seeing things that lead you in possibly multiple new directions. So, thank you for having such a strong passion for story and for teaching others how to access that and to express it. And I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
For having me. I really appreciate being here with you.
Awesome. Thank you, Elayna. We'll see everybody next time.